Hi, hello everybody. So, in my previous video detailing all of the changes and additions that we've been able to see and find in the Chinese beta compared to the North American beta, I really glossed over the changes and all the details with the artifact system rework in a bid to save some time, as I believed it would be much more appropriate to make it its own dedicated video, due to the fact that this is a full system-wide rework. Apart from the name and the general design of the system, it functions entirely differently to the way it did prior. To recap, the previous artifact system would have you split your artifacts between a set of defensive artifacts and a set of offensive artifacts. One would help you take less damage and potentially grant you some more healing, and one set would gradually increase your damage or also increase some certain offensive capabilities such as your debuffs, and there were even some healing artifacts for this if you wanted to take on a more supportive role. The main issues with this artifact system was that there were way too many effects, many of them being entirely redundant with each other, and the other primary issue was the leveling system with the artifacts, which looked somewhat like this. You would have to sacrifice other artifacts of the same category with similar attributes to the one that you have equipped, and it would randomly, depending on the levels of the attributes for the sacrificed artifact, increase the power and strength of certain attributes. Additionally, the set bonuses were limited by the levels of certain attributes. And on top of that, the exotic effects, which were entirely random, could potentially not even function with the particular set it rolled on. All of this led to a very jumbled mess of a system that was unsatisfying and frustrating to work with, which led to almost every single player that I interacted with in the beta to entirely ignore the system and just click auto select, and I don't think that many people even leveled their artifacts outside of the most dedicated players such as myself. With all of that in mind, it should make perfect sense as to why they elected to completely gut the previous system and rework it in its entirety into this new system. Now, from just a glance, you can see that they have cut the amount of artifact slots in half, or at least the amount of artifact slots that are unlocked that we can see, because there is one locked slot up here, which I believe to be for exotics. That is speculation. We do not have any confirmation on this, though. However, what we can see is that each slot contains a unique shape, which means each slot can only slot in one category of a artifact, which makes this system significantly more like the Destiny 2's armor system, in which you would have one chest armor, head armor, leg armor, gloves, and a class item. And I believe this to be a very positive change. Now, instead of artifact sets, we now have artifacts that each individually will give a different bonus effect. And it seems that each slot may have a certain theme or category to what types of bonuses that each artifact will be able to obtain. Across all artifacts, they will have attributes, and these attributes are now, instead of being leveled 1 through 20, are now tiered from 1 through 20, with each tier requiring 20 attribute points. So each artifact will now give a certain amount of attribute points for each attribute, of which there are many. So this is somewhat similar to the stat system now in Destiny, or rather how the stat system was prior to the Edge of Fate rework, because it still works on a tiered system. Now, going into the unique effects of artifacts, I have a number of screenshots here. All of these screenshots are machine translated, so take this with a grain of salt. These may not be emblematic of the particular wordings or the particular effects you may see on the launch of the game. However, we can see here that this artifact's effect is when the shield is broken, you will gain 15.75% of total health as a light shield, which I presume is an overshield, which lasts for 5 seconds and recharges in 16 seconds. So essentially what this means is that this artifact's effect would be to grant you an overshield when your shield is broken, which lasts for 6 seconds and has a cooldown of 16 seconds. And this effect is very similar to a previous Charged with Light mod that we had in Destiny 2. I believe it was called Protective Light. I don't remember that name. That mod was relevant back in Shadowkeep, and I think a little bit into Beyond Light. But moving on to the other effects and stats, we can see here a list of different attributes that are available on artifacts that this guy has equipped. We can see shield enhancement, elemental resistance, defensive enhancement, and melee damage resistance. I believe all of these attributes were available in the beta, maybe not melee damage resistance, or actually no, melee damage resistance was in the beta, but it wasn't specifically melee attacks, it was attacks within a certain range. And I don't think that has changed much since. And here we can see another artifact. This is when covered with a light shield, which is your overshield, you will gain 1.5% of your total HP per second. So you can see here that there is already synergy between different artifacts, even when there are no artifact sets. So you would be able to see here that this effect would directly activate this one. So you would gain the overshield when your shield is broken, and while you have an overshield, your HP will regenerate. And this also gives natural synergy to characters who gain overshields through their abilities, such as Wolf and Yolder. Already we're seeing major improvements with this artifact system, because the prior set bonuses were very, very passive, and really didn't have much synergy between the characters. You pretty much just equipped the ones that would give you the strongest numerical bonuses, and didn't really cause you to play any differently than you might have otherwise. With just these two artifacts alone, it would enable you to play a lot more aggressively, especially if you are playing with a character who is able to naturally gain overshields. And right here is another artifact that would also combo with the other overshield artifacts. And this one says, when obtaining a light shield, it will increase your damage by 9.44% for 6 seconds. So if you're playing a character who can constantly apply overshields, such as Yolder, this will have very high uptime. But even if you aren't playing a character that doesn't have an overshield, you can combo it with this artifact to then, you can combo it with this artifact to then give you that damage buff whenever this overshield gets applied. And we can see a new attribute that actually was not in the North American beta called Damage Enhancement. Now, I believe this is going to be a general damage increase, similar to the very specific damage increases like the elemental damage increases, the specific ability damage increases, and the weapon damage increases that we will see later, which is also a new addition. But will offer this damage increase at a lower percentage in comparison to the more specific counterparts. And here we see another menu detailing different attributes. And we now are moving on to some other screenshots from a completely different artifact set. And you can see that this guy has significantly different artifacts compared to the ones we saw before. And here you can see super enhancement, skill enhancement, vulnerability enhancement, which was the debuff enhancing attribute, and arc enhancement. So the elemental damage increases are still in this game. Now this one right here increases your damage by 7.7% while running. Now I believe this means while sprinting, but it could also mean that it is a damage buff that is granted while you have a movement increase active, which was a previous artifact set bonus prior to this rework. And right here, you can see killing an enemy while in ground movement restores 6.3% of your total HP. I don't know exactly what ground movement refers to, but it's obviously something that we will get more details on when we actually get our hands on the North American full release of Destiny Rising. Now, moving on from that, this screenshot I actually have here to show this screenshot I had here is actually to show this menu instead of the artifact effect itself. This menu shows that each gear level of your artifact will increase the minimum and maximum level of attribute points that will be available on an artifact. scaling all the way up to between 35 and 55 artifact attribute points per node. Now, I don't have any screenshots of mythic artifacts in the Chinese beta. However, I can say that the mythic artifacts and exotic artifacts that were in the North American beta had 3 attribute nodes total, meaning that if you had a mythic artifact with all 3 nodes maxed out, it would be an attribute total of 165 per artifact. Here we have more artifact effects, machine translated, and these are much higher resolution screenshots, so they will be a lot easier for me to read. This one states that when you gain a damage reduction effect, you will also gain the attack and defense in 1 effect, causing your own damage to increase by 1.92% and lasts for 6 seconds, which can be stacked up to 5 times. So that means if you're playing a character who is able to apply damage resistance to themselves multiple times, such as these recommended units right here, you will then gain a stacking damage bonus to dole out against your opponents. Right here you can see the Nourishing Pact artifact effect from earlier, and this one, because it's a higher resolution screenshot, we can see that it actually states that each time you summon a creature, you will recover 7% of your total HP, which means that Ning Fei, who creates a clone of himself whenever he uses his dodge ability, will be able to heal himself in a similar fashion to the Wormhusk Crown in Destiny 2. So already we can see that these artifact effects themselves are very, very potent. But we can also see from this screenshot showing the increasing benefits of your attributes as you level them up. So for defensive enhancement, it says when the damage you take from a single attack is greater than 20% of your total health, there is a 100% chance to reduce the damage by a certain portion. And much like in the North American beta, it seems that these attributes will increase linearly, but it is to be seen if these will greatly diminish after level 15 like they did in the North American beta. Here we can see these attribute effects scaling. Here we can see these attribute effects scaling again, and another new artifact, which states that after using any summon, your own damage will increase for an amount of time. Now this menu right here is the UI showing all of your attributes in great detail, where you would then be able to inspect the different levels of your attributes and how they would scale in the future. One that bears mentioning here is the weapon enhancement, which will increase your primary weapon damage and your powered weapon damage by a lower portion to what your primary damage's increase is. So it would be very similar to the weapon stat that is currently in Destiny 2. However, what we can see up here is the characteristic level, which requires a total amount of attribute points in order to level up. So we can see here that the characteristic effects of these artifacts do have one of those tiers, and the ones that we've all been seeing are all tier 1. What this means is that when you gain more powerful artifacts with higher total attribute scores, this will then proceed to level up and then increase the power of all of your artifacts that you have equipped. Which means that even if you have an artifact that doesn't have very good attributes, if it has a very, very good stat total, you can then equip that to then increase the power of all your artifact effects. And we can see here that number going up in the UI as this person equips a much stronger artifact in comparison to his current one. Now, all of these changes are already extremely exciting. However, there are a couple more features and reveals that I would like to go over. And here we can see what this leveling of the artifact characteristic levels will look like. Beyond reaching the initial tier 2 of 300, reaching tier 3 looks like it'll require 588. Tier 4 requires 1053, and then grants it a masterwork effect on the UI. And reaching tier 5 requires a minimum of 1440. Now, I don't know how many attribute nodes each mythic or exotic artifact would be able to give, or if there are other ways to gain these attribute points that other than from attributes. The total amount of attribute points that 5 artifacts at level 80 with 3 attribute nodes would be able to give is about 825, meaning that we are either going to be able to gain significantly more attribute points than was initially shown, or we will be able to gain attribute points through some other means to level up your characteristic effects on the artifacts even further. And as you can see, the effects of these scale very, very high. This one right here shows that if you are at maximum health, any excess healing beyond that point will then give you an overshield based on a percentage amount for a short duration of 6 seconds, scaling all the way up to 160% of the healing received at its maximum attribute. So these effects are very, very strong. So it'll be a meaningful chase to pursue all of these artifacts at their maximum potential. Now, I was already loving all of these changes that have been shown in these Chinese beta, and this alone would have been enough to make me extremely excited to get into all of these extra ways to increase my character's powers and mix and match the different effects to squeeze the most potential out of each unit. However, there was one extra feature that we were able to discover that will make this even better for all players, and it's right here. Now, what we're looking at is a new UI showing the ability to transfer one artifact's attribute effects to a different artifact. And what this entails is that if you get an artifact that has extremely good stats, and I'm saying like almost max stats or max stats in every single attribute node, however, it doesn't have the particular attributes that you want, if you get a different artifact that maybe has low stats, but has all of the effects that you want on it, you can then transfer those attributes onto the high stat artifact and gain all of those benefits. And this is extremely exciting to see, and it will greatly help so many players when it comes to earning the best gear for each unit. And something else that we can extrapolate from the screenshot through the UI alone is that there is a lot of empty space with all of these attribute slots. In fact, there is twice as much space not filled that there is filled, which means there's the potential that we could see artifacts that have 4 attribute slots, which could push the total amount of attribute stats we gain to a much higher level, which would be interesting to see just how far players will be able to push the power of their characters. And right here, we have the new artifact selection UI for the different artifact selector engrams that we were able to get in both betas. And we can see here there is one tab for each slot, each individual artifact having 1 or more units that they are recommended on, and every unit having multiple different artifact types recommended for them. However, what we can extrapolate from this is that there is a lot of them. A lot of unique effects, a lot of different ways that you can combo to gain more power and squeeze even more strength into your units. This was one of the main reasons why I wasn't bothered as much about the wolf nerf, the minuscule wolf nerf, because with this, we will be able to put so much more power into each individual character than we would have been able to before with the previous iteration of this artifact system. And that is everything that I have to show for today. Each day that passes is one day closer to the full North American release of Destiny Rising. If you are just as excited about this game as I am, make sure that you pre-register for the game on the official website. Leave a comment down below for which artifact effect excites you the most. And if you want to talk to me more directly, you can also join my Discord server in the link down below. If you were enjoying my coverage of this news for Destiny Rising, and if you would like to see more guides, news, etc., feel free to subscribe to my channel. Every single time I gain a new subscriber, I receive their power. With that all out of the way, I will see you all next time.